This is the story of Napoleon. He was a small boy from a small island, and he became the master of almost all of Europe. He won battle after battle, and kings were afraid of his name. But he wanted more, always more, and that hunger would destroy him. So sit back, listen slowly, and learn English with the dark story of Napoleon. Napoleon was born more than 200 years ago on a small island in the sea called Corsica. His family was not rich, and they were not powerful. He was not even truly French at first. On his island, people spoke a different language, and the other children would later laugh at the way he spoke. Napoleon was small, he was poor, and he was a foreigner. But inside this little boy there was a fire, and that fire would one day burn the whole world. When he was a young boy, his family sent him far away to a military school in France. There, the rich French students laughed at him. They laughed at his name. They laughed at his accent. They laughed at his poor family. Napoleon had no money and few friends, so he did the one thing that was his to do. He studied. While the others played, he read books about war, about history, about great leaders of the past. He was quiet, he was serious, and he was always watching. He learned a hard lesson very early. If you are not born with power, you must take it. Then, all across France, the ground began to shake. The people of France rose up against their king. It was a revolution. The old world was breaking apart, and in the chaos, there was blood, fear, and opportunity. For a poor young officer with a brilliant mind, this was the perfect storm. In a time of order, no one would have listened to him. But in a time of chaos, talent could rise like fire. And Napoleon did rise. He was given command of soldiers, and very quickly, everyone could see that this young man was different. He was fast. He was bold. He made decisions in seconds while older generals were still thinking. He cared for his soldiers, and they began to love him. In one famous moment, he stood in the middle of the danger, with cannons firing around him, and he did not run. His men saw it, and a legend began to grow. Soon, France sent him to fight in faraway lands, and there his legend exploded. In Italy, with a small and hungry army, he defeated forces much larger than his own. He moved his men so fast that the enemy never knew where he would appear. He won, and he won, and he won again. The whole of France began to say one name with wonder: Napoleon. He was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming a hero, the man who could not be beaten. But Napoleon wanted more than victories. He wanted power itself. So he came back to France, where the new government was weak and the people were tired of chaos. And with the army behind him, Napoleon took control of the entire country. There was no king now, but there was something just as powerful. There was Napoleon. He told the people he would bring order, glory, and greatness. And many of them believed him, because he gave them exactly that. For a time, it was a golden age. Napoleon was a brilliant ruler, not only a soldier. He built new roads. He built new schools. He created a new system of laws that was so clear and so fair that countries still use parts of it today. He brought order out of chaos. The poor boy from the small island had become the most important man in France. And then, in a grand and golden ceremony, he placed a crown upon his own head. Napoleon was now an emperor. Now all the old kings of Europe were afraid. Who was this man, this commoner, this emperor who came from nothing? They did not want him to exist. So again and again, they joined together and went to war against him. And again, Napoleon crushed them. At a great battle called Austerlitz, he destroyed two mighty empires in a single day. It was perhaps his most perfect victory. He seemed less like a man and more like a force of nature. Most of Europe was now under his control or his command. But here, we must see the danger inside him. Napoleon could not stop. Every victory made him want another. Every crown made him want one more. He placed his brothers and his friends on the thrones of other countries, as if Europe were his own family business. He was no longer fighting to protect France. He was fighting to feed his own endless hunger, and slowly, that hunger began to make him blind. His first great mistake was in the south, in Spain. He thought it would be easy. He put his own brother on the Spanish throne. But the people of Spain did not want a foreign king. They rose up against him, not as a great army, but as thousands of small fighters who attacked and then disappeared. It was a long, ugly, bleeding war that Napoleon could not win and could not end. It quietly drained his strength, year after year. But Napoleon barely looked at it. His eyes were already turning towards something far bigger and far colder. That something was Russia. Russia was vast, and its emperor would no longer obey him. So Napoleon decided to punish it. He gathered the largest army the world had ever seen, hundreds of thousands of men from all across his empire, and he marched east into the enormous, endless land of Russia. It was the greatest army of its time, led by the greatest general of its time. It looked unstoppable. It was, in truth, a march toward death. The Russians did something clever and terrible. They did not stand and fight. They retreated deeper and deeper into their own country. And as they went, they burned everything behind them. They burned the food. They burned the farms. They burned their own villages so that Napoleon's army would find nothing but ash. Napoleon marched all the way to the great city of Moscow, and when he arrived, he found it almost empty. And then the city went up in flames. He had marched into the heart of Russia, and he had won nothing at all. And then came the real enemy, winter. The Russian winter fell upon Napoleon's army like the hand of death. The temperature dropped far below freezing. The soldiers had no food and no shelter. Now Napoleon had to retreat back across the same burned and frozen land, and it became a nightmare beyond words. Men froze where they walked. They starved. They fell in the snow and never rose again. The largest army in the world melted away into the ice. Of the hundreds of thousands who marched into Russia, only a small, broken few came back. Napoleon's strength was gone. Now the kings of Europe saw their chance. Napoleon was wounded, and they came at him from every side, all together. He still fought brilliantly. He still won battles, but he could not win them all. Not anymore. There were simply too many enemies and too few soldiers. At last they entered France itself. They took his capital city, and they forced the great emperor to give up his throne. They sent him away to a tiny island, far out in the sea, and they told him his story was over. But Napoleon's story was not over yet. In secret, he escaped from the island and returned to France. And what happened next is almost impossible to believe. The soldiers who were sent to arrest him saw his face, heard his voice, and instead of stopping him, they followed him. In a matter of days, without firing a shot, Napoleon took back his entire empire. The whole of Europe trembled. The emperor had returned, but this return would be short. It would last only about 100 days. All of his enemies gathered their armies for one final battle, near a place whose name the world would never forget, Waterloo. There, on a single rain-soaked day, Napoleon fought his last fight. It was close, terribly close. But by the end of the day, his army was broken and Napoleon had lost everything forever. The age of Napoleon was over. This time, his enemies took no chances. They sent him to a different island, much smaller and much more lonely, far away in the middle of a great ocean where no one could rescue him. And there, on that distant rock, surrounded by the sea, the man who had once ruled most of Europe lived out his final years as a prisoner. The emperor of the world now had a small house, a few servants, and the endless waves. And there, alone and far from his beloved France, Napoleon grew sick and slowly the fire inside him went out. He died on that island, a prisoner to the very end. So, what do we learn from the dark story of Napoleon? We see a poor boy who was laughed at and who used his mind and his will to conquer almost the entire world. He proved that where you are born does not decide how far you can go. But we also see the other side. His greatest strength, his endless hunger, was also the thing that destroyed him. He could conquer kings and empires, but he could never conquer his own need for more. And in the end, that hunger carried him from a throne above all of Europe to a lonely rock in the middle of the sea. Thank you for listening and for learning English with me today. I hope this story was clear and easy to follow. If you enjoyed it, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. I love to read your messages. And if you want more true stories, told slowly in simple English, then stay with me. Because history is full of dark and powerful tales, and together, we are only just beginning.